Hi, friends. Welcome to another episode of Prodigal Pastor. If you listen to our first handful of episodes, in that we did a series exploring how do we read and understand the Bible with some of my favorite and most influential theologians and Bible scholars and authors. I hope that set of conversations was helpful to you because it was sure helpful to me. Today, or in this episode, we're going to begin another kind of series of conversations on a topic that is very important to me. One that I am kind of obsessed with, that I teach about a lot, I'm writing about a lot on my Substack, I read about a lot. And this subject is the atonement, or the cross. What does the cross do? What does it accomplish? What does it mean about God, about us, and about the world around us? And I am obsessed with this conversation because, well, the cross is sort of at the center of our faith. It's the chief icon, chief symbol, and chief event that sort of orients and defines our faith. And yet, it is also one of those events, symbols, that has the weightiest and sometimes most baggage connected to it. When people hear and see the cross, it is hard sometimes to separate it from tradition and images of God as angry, wrathful, judgmental, punishing, and to understand how it could be an image of love, union, reconciliation, or how it could be an image that means something for us in our ethical life and how we live and all the other things that come with that. And so because of that, because I hear these questions, because I'm wrestling with these questions all the time, the next set of episodes that we will be releasing will focus on the cross. What does the cross mean? What does it do? What does it accomplish? Why does it accomplish those things? How do we think about it historically, theologically, and biblically? And hopefully we'll answer the question of what does it mean for us? Or maybe I should say questions. What does it do for us? How does it shape us? How does it speak to the world that we live in today? In this first episode, we're interviewing a writer and a theologian that I feel very grateful for, a man by the name of Dr. Mark Baker. Mark has written a bunch of marvelous books, but one especially that I read in preparation for this conversation and for other writings is a book called Recovering the Scandal of the Cross that he wrote with Joel Green, another wonderful Bible scholar. And the book is about the atonement, and it is dense and thick and educational and really helpful. And in this conversation, Dr. Mark Baker takes all of his years of thinking and writing about the atonement and makes it accessible for us today to understand what it is, all the images that shape it, and what it might mean for us. This is a great primer if this is a new conversation for you, or if you come with a lot of assumptions about the cross are and what it's for and want to explore that in more depth. So without further ado, I will stop yapping at you and get to our conversation with Mark Baker. Well, Dr. Mark Baker, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We are beginning a set of conversations on how to understand atonement and the cross, which is a weighty subject, but one that you have written on a lot in ways that are very helpful. So we'll get into all of that in a moment, your work, your research, your writing, your books, your thoughts on atonement. But before we do, I like to ask every guest when they first come on the show, how did you get here? What led you into the world of theological study, atonement, teaching in seminary, writing about scripture? How did you end up in this line of vocation?
That is a great question, Jonny, and one I love to bring up at the beginning of my theology classes at a seminary. And so I tell this story of being a senior in college and really uninterested in theology. There was I went to Wheaton College, and there was a required theology course we had to take. And my roommate, you could opt to take a whole year systematic theology if you wanted to, instead of just this one quarter. And my roommate did that. And I mean, honestly, it was just beyond my comprehension. I'm like, Kevin, why would you do that? I was not interested in theology. And to make clear, when I say this, it's not that I was a lackluster Christian. I was fully committed. I was a double major in what we called Christian education back then, probably called Christian ministry now. But yeah, I thought, I know theology. Why would I? And it didn't engage me, didn't feel important. So then the question is, that's Mark Baker, senior in college. Today, Mark Baker, PhD in theology, seminary professor. How did I get here to teaching this class to you students? Yeah, the short version of it is right after I graduated, I went to Honduras, Central America, and I was, so a few things here. And then again, this longer story, but just to make it very brief. Yeah, I'm thrust into this situation of being surrounded by extreme poverty. And I'm reading my Bible and noticing all these verses about the poor and the justice, and just asking the question, like, why had I not seen these before? And of course, I mean, I had, but, in the dispensationalist church world that I grew up in, yeah, we read the Bible in ways that led us to spiritualize things, to not put attention on that. And so the first thing that interested me in theology, and again, when I was in Honduras, I was working as a chaplain, teaching Bible, social studies in a bilingual school, reading books about, how to disciple, evangelize, counsel, church leadership. But I started becoming interested in theology because I came to see that there were different ways of reading the Bible. And then as I met some Mennonites and became introduced to a more holistic gospel, and then came to see that, like how one read the Bible matters, because do I have this, individualistic, spiritual, future, personal view of salvation only and read the Bible through that lens, or through another lens, and said, it's not just, I've got this down. So that's the first thing. Then the second was I encountered situations, this was back in the 80s, there was wars going on in Central America, and, questions about violence, revolution, how does a Christian respond, that, my theology just was not up to answering. And so I started, picked a book up by Jacques Ellul, Violence from a Christian Perspective, which is something like I just would have never read on my own in college, but like in that context, I was, just soaking it up. And then fundamentally, and this gets into, why seminary professor, I started becoming, I think when I got to Honduras, my question was, do you believe in God? Would you like to accept Jesus as your personal savior? And I just kind of rushed past it, believe in God. But I more and more became sensitive to who is the God you believe in, because I encountered many people in Honduras, believers or ones who I wouldn't, call a believer, but whose view of God was of a distant, angry, judging figure. And I came to realize how one thinks about God matters. It's not just enough to say, I believe in God. And that's theology, in the most basic sense, is how we think about God. And what I came to encounter over my years in Honduras was, what I thought was some pretty toxic theology I experienced in different churches. And so I wanted, one, to spend more time in learning a healthier, less toxic theology myself, and then be in a position where I could influence pastors, teachers, others to, lessen the toxic theology there is in the world. So that's really what, took me to seminary, and then eventually to a PhD.
Interesting.
And then, I mentioned the atonement story because it's particularly, and I think sets up other things we'll talk about well here. So in a couple different ways. So first, I'm in seminary, and this is after I'd been in Honduras 4 years, worked with InterVarsity for a few years. So again, to say, I've been in ministry, done evangelism, and I had never thought like critically about the atonement, because I only knew one way of talking about the cross. And it was one I knew well, that, God is a holy and just God. We're sinners. God can't just forgive us. God wouldn't be a just God if God just forgave us. So there needs to be punishment. And so God punished Jesus in our place, and then God could forgive us. And that was the story. I mean, even if I didn't go into those details, that was the story I believed in, I used in ministry. And so I like mentioning this whenever I talk about atonement, because I'm now critical of that version of the story. But I don't look back on the 15 years of ministry when I was using that story as, a total waste, or saying my coming to Jesus through that story means it wasn't authentic. So I'm not attacking people's experience of Jesus through that story. My fundamental line is, we can do better, we must do better. Okay, so why do I say that now? So I'm in seminary, and so two things came together. And so in a theology class, we read this little book called Christus Victor by Gustav Aulén, who's a theologian from Sweden. This book is written in the middle of the 20th century, and he in essence is arguing for a Christus Victor, or understanding of the atonement of that the atonement, the cross and resurrection is about triumph over sin, death, and the devil. And he said, that's what the cross and atonement is about, not this other story that I had just mentioned. And I wasn't fully convinced by the book in saying, this is it rather than this. But what it did is it opened up space. Like, I didn't know there was another option. And so then once I have an option, then I could look at the story I'd always told. I could evaluate it. Whereas before, how can you evaluate, the thing that is central to the faith? And there's just, this is it. I'm not going to evaluate, or, I'm not a Christian. So there's space to evaluate. Okay. So now a little background to the next scene in this little story is my wife was someone. I had not had this experience, but my wife grew up as someone who was afraid of God, pretty terrified of hell. One of those ones, accepted Jesus numerous times, like, what if it didn't stick? And just afraid of God fundamentally. Okay. So, and I knew that. She had progressed, but that, is still part of her story. Okay. So we were going to seminary together. So I'm writing a book review on Gustav Aulin. And I sort of have this, because of being able to evaluate, I kind of lean back and I say to my wife, I say, Lynn, this way we talk about the cross, it could lead someone to view God as, as a pretty angry, punishing kind of figure. And she looks at me, kind of with like, well, isn't that obvious, Mark? Like, did you have to come to seminary? I mean, it was kind, but it was sort of like, and then she said, well, yes, that's why it's that story, that story about the cross is why I was so afraid of God as a little girl. And in that moment, Jonny, I thought this must change. 9-year-old girls should not be in our churches afraid of God because of our theology. There may be other things that lead them to fear God. Their own, maybe they have a really bad father figure themselves, whatever. But it shouldn't be because of our theology.
Yes.
And so, now, be very clear. It wasn't in that moment I said, I'm going to write a book to change this. But it was just this passion, this must change. And of course, I mean, that was 1987, 88. The first book I wrote on atonement with Joel Green was published, I think, in 99 or 2000. So, like I say, it's not like I just turned around, okay, let's write a book. Because I had to figure out, I didn't have any other options myself at that time. But that's the story of why atonement. And I love that story because I think people hear Dr. Mark Baker, PhD in theology, and they imagine me like, walking through the library thinking like, oh, what will my next book be about? And, oh, here's an interesting book about the atonement I'll write. This topic for me is rooted in mission, in pastoral concern.
Yeah.
And that's where it comes from.
I love that. There's so many things that you've just named that I want to tap into, because I think there's so much there that is helpful. The story, though, is really meaningful because I think that's also my experience and why I wanted to have a conversation about atonement, and why I feel like my whole pastoral ministry is oriented around is you would have people come into a pastoral meeting wrestling with something deep and afraid to take it to God because of the consequences of a judgmental or angry God. You're like, we have so lost the vision of God that it seems to me Jesus presents, especially in parables like the prodigal son, of a father who is so welcoming.
Yes, exactly.
And we have presented something very different that makes people frightened. And yet we say, he loves you. You're like, this
God
is a
love.
confusing messaging to all of those in between. And then you said two other things that I just want to name. I love that you talked about Christus Victor and how it opened up possibility. I feel like I see this all the time as people learn that there is more atonement models throughout history. Even if they don't align with one, it reminds us that our approach to this very dense concept has been broad and beautiful, which you do a lot of writing about in terms of the historic models and also modern models from around the world that help us see the way the cross is good news to cultures all over is very different than sometimes we have limited it to be.
Yes.
And then finally, I'll ask you a question. What tradition did you grow up in? Because you mentioned encountering Mennonites. I would have assumed you grew up maybe closer to an Anabaptist perspective of faith, but it sounds like you found that as an adult.
Yeah, no, so I grew up, mostly independent Bible churches, dispensationalists. I mentioned I went to Wheaton College. That was a broadening experience for me, meeting Christians from other streams, and sort of left there probably, sort of broadly mainstream evangelical, but yeah, not the least bit Mennonite or Anabaptist. And I met Mennonites in Honduras and was attracted to them for a variety of reasons. They tended to live more simply than most other missionaries, and that attracted me. More holistic gospel. And then, when I bumped into this violence question, and then, fundamentally the value given to community and transformation through communities being salt and light. Those are all things that attracted me to Anabaptism, but wasn't part of my background.
Interesting. That's so interesting. Yeah, when you mentioned dispensationalism, then you mentioned Wheaton, and I was like, neither of those are key Anabaptist phrases.
Right.
But I grew up in a Pentecostal church that was very dispensational. And so you named spiritualizing material concerns felt very common in the environment I grew up in. Anabaptism felt like an antidote to that. So that's interesting. Pressing into some of the things that you have named, especially about your experience around atonement, I'd love to just dive into this conversation specifically. And maybe you could help us with a bit of a definition of terms, because I feel like we throw some of these words around a lot. Atonement, cross. What do we mean when we talk about these things? And what do you mean when you talk about the atonement or about the cross? Could you define some of that for us?
Yeah. So I think, atonement, I mean, the word literally, and I think it's a word that maybe Tyndale or Wycliffe invented in English, but, it's at one meant to become one. And so we probably misuse it because we apply it very broadly. I heard a podcast this week where someone said, basically atonement has almost become synonymous with soteriology.
Yes.
Atonement, the word, it has to do with reconciliation. But as I use it in our conversation today in my books, Joel and I decided that we would define it as the saving significance of the cross.
Yes.
So that's my short definition. But then even that, I think, is problematic because we also, I think, use the cross as a bigger thing because it's really the saving significance of the cross and resurrection, or I think, under the influence of someone like Irenaeus would say, the saving significance of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So I use these terms more as, in a broad sense of the saving significance of those things rather than more narrowly. So cross meaning cross and resurrection. An important thing on words, for listeners, but also in others that use conversation. Joel and I, after our first book came out, we got a lot of pushback of, people. We had thought, InterVarsity Press asked us, do you affirm substitutionary atonement? Because they couldn't publish a book that was against their confession of faith. And we said, yes, we affirm substitutionary atonement. We critique what we call penal substitution theory of atonement. But for many people, atonement, cross, substitutionary atonement, penal substitutionary atonement, they're all the same. It's just one thing. And I make very clear, atonement is a big category.
Yes.
Substitutionary atonement is a smaller umbrella under that big category. And then penal substitution theory of atonement is a smaller category under the umbrella of substitutionary atonement.
Yes. That's so helpful. I think kind of defining some of those terms is atonement describes something large and I love that phrase. It's just helpful for us in simplicity, the saving significance of the cross and the resurrection. And then you can continue to drill down in that phrase to say there's smaller categories underneath it. And this leads me to a third question I wanted to ask you that I think you already started to address, which is what do we get wrong about the atonement as we talk about it today? And it feels like one of the things you just named is we conflate all of atonement with a narrow category. It feels like one of the chief problems of the way we talk about it today.
Okay, so first of all, I want to be, careful scholar communicator on the we.
Yeah.
So something that I got wrong about the atonement, and I'm guessing, you did too from your background. But so I'd say something I had gotten wrong about the atonement and many others, but, not necessarily all Christians. Certainly the Eastern Orthodox didn't get this wrong. But okay, so the way I would say two things that I think we've gotten wrong. So I invite people to imagine like a rectangular box with arrows coming out of the top of it. And that rectangular box for me represents what I call the foundational narrative of the atonement. And that includes, Jesus's life, what we have in the Gospels. I think it's a key thing we've gotten wrong is we haven't rooted, in terms of penal substitution, haven't rooted it in Jesus's life. It's a mechanics borrowed from elsewhere. So we have this box, and all the arrows coming out of it are different images of the atonement in the New Testament, but they're all rooted in this foundational narrative. One of those arrows is the legal image. Legal thing, Romans 3, justification. That's one arrow, and that is in the Bible. That's in the New Testament. But the arrow that I think I had made, and many others with me, is we'd taken that one arrow and made it the foundational story. So if you got the picture, we had this box, like a brick there, that shape, with these arrows coming at it. And we've taken one arrow, which is just an image, we flipped it on its side and made it the foundational narrative. And right there, we're losing because you end up with a much thinner, narrower foundation. And some of the other arrows, we stick onto that arrow, which I think leads us to misinterpret them. Say like sacrifice. My students, I'd say, sacrifice, it's through the lens of penal substitution. We think it's paying God, appeasing God. But you go read Leviticus and, it's not in Leviticus. So, but we tend to read other images in light of that one legal image.
Yes.
So that's one mistake, is making one image the story, the foundation for others when it's just an image. Then the other big error is that one image, which is New Testament, I don't say, well, let's get rid of this legal image. Like, no, that's a good Pauline image, but we have it in the wrong courtroom. So it's a legal image, but since the Reformation, we have this idea of satisfaction, substitution in terms of, I would say, modern Western legal thinking. And I think Paul was, he was rooted in the Old Testament, the world of his time. He was in what I call a Hebraic courtroom, in quotes. And so it was what is Hebraic justice is much more relational, covenantal, and it's, making things right. Much more, for listeners who are familiar with restorative justice, it's in that line, restorative justice, question is what's wrong and how do we make it right?
Yeah.
Whereas this Western model, it ends up picturing God. So what does it mean? For God to be just, God has to punish because that's what the law says. But if we're in a Hebraic courtroom, for God to be just, God must be faithful to God's covenant commitments, which are, to bring salvation and blessing through Israel and to make things right. So just to bring this together. So two mistakes is to take one image and make it the story, and which leaves out others, and to have that one image placed in the wrong courtroom. And I think those are fundamental errors behind penal substitution theory thinking about the cross.
I think that is naming those two things is very helpful, because your one image becomes the whole image, and then we try to, exactly as you said, read all of Scripture through that lens, which leads to, I think, some pretty substantial consequences for how we read Scripture, as you named earlier, how we see God, how we see one another, how we see our mission in the world. Like, so much is oriented around it. And then the second piece you named feels really essential, and we may have oriented it around the wrong courtroom. So we're orienting around like a more modern or German or Reformation courtroom, which I understand why the image was good news when it arrived, but it may not be helpful to understanding what justification looks like in Scripture. I mean, that's such a profound naming of those two realities for us.
Yes.
This leads to, I think, something that you do really well and want to press into a bit, is that you don't reject that legal image. It feels like the priority in some of your writing is to offer a multiplicity of images. And so could you talk a little bit about because you named that legal as one image, could you talk a little bit about the other images that you see, whether they're stories that you see in Scripture, and why it feels so essential to have a multiplicity of images?
Yeah, so let me go with why essential first, and then I'll give a few examples. So one reason it's essential is because people are lost in different ways. And I mean that both in the sense of salvation, but also pastorally, even after we have become Christians. And so and I mean, borrow from Scott McKnight. He says, so if you're playing golf and you only have one club in your bag, it's good in certain situations, but it's not good in all situations.
Yes.
Or I say, like a toolbox, a screwdriver is a good tool for certain situations, but when you need a hammer, a screwdriver is not a good thing. And just to give, a quick concrete example of this is, so I've been leading Bible studies in the county jail for over 15 years now. And so, so using an explanation of the cross that gets to liberation from guilt, you can imagine that's a very effective and important tool to bring into a jail setting. So I do that, but also are carrying huge burdens of shame. The freedom from guilt aspect of the cross doesn't touch on shame. So they can be relieved of guilt, but they still walk around feeling excluded, looked down upon. And so I regularly in the jail talk about the cross in terms of release from guilt, but also, and you mentioned already, I go to Luke 15 and Jesus telling the parable of the prodigal son, and especially put in context why he was telling it and who's there, and then talk about the cross in terms of, Jesus being willing to bear our shame in our place so that we are released from it. So I would not be able to do that. I would not be doing that if I was still back with the one arrow, the one story. And so pastorally, and that's that's one example, but there's other
profound
things of if someone's feeling, lost, meaningless, in grief, there's just there's a variety of things we can bring. And then, this is overlapping that, but there's also the cultural communication aspect. So, which goes, it's overlapping, but just quickly to do this. So for instance, in African or tribal contexts, the leading pressing thing tends to be fear of evil spirits, demons. And so to proclaim the cross as freedom from guilt, again, that's a good thing, but it doesn't touch on their fear of this spirit that's very real. And the cross, Christus Victor, is very powerful in relation to that. So let's use the full collection we have. Or, in honor-shame contexts, in, Asia, again, the way we talk about sin and guilt, it doesn't connect. But they're in an honor-shame culture, and if you can come in and talk about salvation in terms of shame and honor, the cross in terms of that, much more effective. So that's some of the why.
Yeah.
So this is not a full list. In our book, Recovering the Skin of the Cross, we have a list of different New Testament images, and then, thank you, and we, talk about them. So but here's just a few. So one, redemption. And I'm starting with this one because this is through the lens of that one arrow. If we're thinking penal satisfaction, then redemption is a payment. And who do we picture is, Jesus is paying God so that we can be redeemed. But in its biblical context, redemption is biblical and cultural. Redemption is much more about release. And so it's, redemption is, so like if I'm the older son in a family, then it is my responsibility when I become the leader of the family is to care for others. And if one of my brothers, gets into debt, and loses his land or whatever, gets carried off, whatever, then it's my job as older to redeem him, which means rescuing him. And that may mean buying him back out of slavery, but it might be going and helping him farm better. The idea is I'm bringing him back into our family in wholeness. So God redeemed Israel from Egypt. There was no payment there. I could go on. I'll leave it at that and say the Bible Project this summer did a great podcast series on redemption. I don't know, 10 episodes or something. So if you want to go into like in depth, and they just do a great job of looking at its biblical roots and then implications for cross and resurrection. So another image, justification, the legal one, and that I already mentioned, but just to say how differently this feels through the lens of a Hebraic courtroom. And so to be justified means to be made right and to be brought into right relationship. So it's not just what I think it was Marcus Bart called a legal fiction of, well, and we used to say this. I mean, when I was a kid, justified, just as if I'd never sinned. God sees me just as if I'd never sinned, but I have, of course. So, and there's some of that. I am released from that, but it's about being brought into right relationships, and something changes. God is working to make things right in my life and in relation to others.
Yeah.
And then, I think as an individualist North American, I tend to run past, but language of in Christ or union with Christ is very, very common in Pauline literature, and it has significant atonement implications of being united with Christ. So then, in triumph with him over sin and death, being united with him to be brought back into covenant relationship. So those are a few images. Would you like a couple more, or should we move on?
I would love. I think this is so helpful. I think this is so helpful in expanding our imagination for atonement. And so, feel free to go on and rattle a few more of those images off.
I'll do two more. So one is, again, I've already mentioned that Christus Victor is triumph over the devil, powers of evil. But, and this gets a bit into my, bounded church, centered church kind of thinking. But in Colossians 2:15, just a beautiful verse of the powers being disarmed, exposed by the cross. I mean, it's clear, this Christus Victor language. But then, the verses immediately before that about this debt, and then the verses immediately after it are about, religious rules. And so it's a sense of this religious power that we are bound up by and enslaved by. And so I think the image of the cross that we can proclaim is that through the cross and resurrection, we are liberated from this religiosity of oughtness, of having to measure up and do these things. And then Paul, picks up that language in Galatians that, we are freed in Christ. So I just recently was in a church we were singing, And Can It Be, great hymn by Charles Wesley. And I was saying, and there's, the third or fourth stanza, it talks about, my chains fell off. And, when I was a kid in high school and college, I sing that song, and it had no meaning to me, because I'm like, I've always been a good kid. Like, I wasn't a drug addict. Like, I'm like, what chains? But I sing it now. And I was moved to tears on Sunday, because I think, I was bound by religion, by bounded church religiosity.
Yes.
And through Jesus' death and resurrection, I have been freed from that. And okay, just one more in this related to that. But I think another one we miss, and this isn't so much an image or metaphor, but it's the actual event of Jesus's life and death. And I think, again, and I'd say to my students, I'd say, okay, I think a huge weakness, I think, of penal substitution theory of atonement is Jesus's life is not part of the logic of that explanation of the atonement. The only way it's important is that he had to live without sin. So when I would describe it in class, I draw this big square on the board, and that's Jesus' life, and it's blank, no sin, and that's so that he could die and be punished in our place. Jesus got killed. Like, people were upset with him. They killed him because he was causing trouble.
Yeah.
One of the reasons he died, and I love this in Luke 15. I say to, whether I'm doing this, in a jail Bible study or in class. And so at the beginning of that scene, Jesus is standing there, and he's eating with the tax collectors and sinners. The Pharisees come up and, oh, look at this guy. Look who he's hanging out. He even eats with them. And so I say, if in that moment, if Jesus wanted to save his reputation, what would he have done? And if he was most concerned about his honor, saving face, he would have said to the Pharisees, oh, hey, I'm new to town. I didn't know who these people are. Let's go have lunch and go off with the Pharisees. But what did Jesus do is he stood with the outcasts, with the shamed. He told 3 parables to defend them, to invite the Pharisees to join him at the table in celebration.
Yeah.
And Jesus was willing to suffer shame, dishonor, in order to stand with those people. And he did that all the way to the cross.
Yeah.
I mean, he literally died in solidarity with the shame. He took on their shame. And then in resurrection, it's an invitation to all of us to say, there is life beyond shame. And Jesus has carried it.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That reminds me, I mean, it makes me think of James Cone's writing and how the cross is like an act of solidarity.
Yeah.
And that is something that is removed if we miss that image, which is such a powerful image, that Christ became like us so that we could become like him on the other side of resurrection, but that he came all the way in to what it means to be human, all the way to the shame and to death. Yeah, that's so beautiful. That's such a helpful.
Let me, you're the one asking the questions, but if I can interrupt to say, so, I mean, that was a great question, and I like doing that, and
yeah,
it was great to think about and, get my passion flowing a bit. An important thing, however, that Joel Green and I make, a point we make near the end of our book is, it is important to read and think about these images and metaphors in the Bible and preach and teach them today. But just or as more important is to learn from the way the New Testament authors used imagery and then come up with new imagery that is biblically rooted in our time and place. And so
could you give us any examples of more like modern imagery that's biblically reflective and faithful, but applied to a more modern context?
Yeah, so I'll start with one that most people will know, so C.S. Lewis in the stone table scene at in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so first of all, it's clearly substitutionary. Aslan is dying in the place of Edmund. And many people, I think because they're so taken up by that one era, that one story, they assume it's penal satisfaction, but it's not. It's about, Lewis is very clear. It's about, the laws, the magic of the world, and the White Witch thinks I've won.
Yes.
But then there's deeper magic. And so I think Lewis is doing a great job there of saying, the cross and resurrection, this is not according to the logic of the world. And so I'd say to my students, if you have cross thinking that is based on calculus of the world, of our Western courtroom, like, you haven't gone far enough. And so it's this deeper magic that then through the resurrection, salvation is brought and new life is brought in. So, and I think that's a great imagery that Lewis does there. But a couple others, just very simple. I mean, one of the stories, and this is Chris Friesen in the book, he sets up this narrative of people being in a coffee shop, the coffee spills, and, someone drops, puts their napkin down to soak up the coffee, and then saying, that's what the cross and resurrection does. It absorbs sin. So we could go with, the scapegoat back in Leviticus, a biblical imagery, or you could use something like that, this coffee rolling up. Then another, I think, borrowing from movies. In the book, there's one image at the back that borrowed from The Green Mile. I like using the ending of Gran Torino, the imagery of, I can't remember the character's name, but Clint Eastwood dying in the place of, and it's fascinating, the variety of things that had to happen for that to work and how it matches up with the cross. So those are a few.
Oh, I love that. I like that. And I also like the permission that you've just given us to sort of be creative with the cross so that it is communicated in ways that are understandable and relevant to a changing culture and a changing time, and to folks who may not have the theological background that made some of the older images make sense in being communicated. But, I think our culture is becoming post-biblically literate. And so it's like, how do you communicate these things effectively and accurately in a way that connects? I think that's so helpful. I want to so we've named some of these images, which is so helpful for kind of expanding our imagination. I want to dive in a little further here and talk about how you understand the problems that atonement is trying to solve and how these images even speak to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about this a lot because our understanding of sin or the problems of the world will so shape what we think the cross needs to do. And then you wrote recently on a blog that wasn't necessarily about atonement, but was about sin. And then you have written about PSA and appeasing God and how it solves that problem. But I think that there's so much within that image conversation, our imaginations around what the problem is pretty limited to it's a legal problem, it's a
Right.
appeasement of God problem. So can you speak a bit to what problem you see the cross is trying to solve, or problems is probably a better way of saying it, and if you feel like it's worth it, like even going into how you think about sin a bit? I know it's a bigger conversation, but I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, no, I think it's very important. In the last chapter of our book, Recovering the Scan of the Cross, which is a chapter that Joel, my co-author, wrote, and he's a biblical scholar, and so, much better at this. But he has, I mean, it's almost a page in the book of like different language and conceptions of sin is in the Bible. And our purpose for doing that is to make very concretely the point you're making is if sin is the problem and there's this whole variety of aspects of sin, then the solution needs to deal with that. So yeah, going back to what we said, we can't have just this narrow thing. Sin is missing the mark is a very classical biblical word of it, but it's also rebellion against God, thinking like the image of marital infidelity in Hosea. And missing the mark, that tends to be, this, then it's kind of like this standard and I fall short. But Paul, most often talks about sin as an enslaving force. So not so much it's this demerit, but it's an enslaving force. And so we both, and I think this is important again, because I think at times people react so strongly to penal substitution theory of atonement that they dump all that and to say, no, actually, sin is transgressing the law in the biblical sense. And so that's part of it. But it is also this enslaving thing. And then, and I co-authored a book on ministry and honor and shame cultures, which led me to be much more sensitive to this, that sin is also dishonoring God. And so how does the cross and resurrection, how does it respond to that? And this, rooted, I mean, in language that, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us, but the language impurity of, or uncleanliness in the Old Testament, the separation is an aspect of biblical sin. And so, and then also, I think in trying to make this broader, it's also not just what we are saved from, but also what we're saved for. And that that's something that was, if we go back to the story I started with. So I started all this within, pretty narrow, like I was upset with the way this was leading people to think about God. And that's where I started my work on this. But then over time, I got just a much deeper, richer appreciation for the cross and resurrection, and also realizing its significance in how it brings us into community, union with God, with the Holy Spirit, and how it's putting us on the path of justice with God.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so helpful to both name that there's what we're saved from, and having a more robust understanding of sin helps us to have a bigger, more robust understanding of the cross. If the cross is saving us from missing the mark, that's an important part. If it's enslavement and overcoming the enslavement, that's an important part. I think about Irenaeus, who you mentioned earlier, who talks about sin is the old wound and Christ is healing on the cross. Like a lot of our atonement images forget the healing of the cross. It actually helps expand how good news works and how good it is.
Yes.
And then there's the other side that you just named. And then what are we invited into? To participation in the life, way, work, and love of God, a God who is actually very loving. With that said, I wonder if you would, there's so many questions I would want to ask you here, but I'm going to respect your time as much as possible. But we've named some of this in the conversations that we've been having, but I'd wonder if you would talk about how and why, or how you feel like the cross can shape our Christian lives. Because you talked about our images of God, and a little bit of like your ethics in Honduras. So we've like kind of named all these images, and you even just started to like piece some of this together, and I want to dive into it. Like, how does misunderstanding the cross shape the way we live or misshape the way we live? And how can a right understanding of the cross empower the way that we live for worship, ethics, community? Like, I feel like some of the things you were naming there right at the end.
Okay, I think that could be a very long answer.
Yeah.
I will answer it. I'll go narrow with just thinking about justification through the lenses of PSA or through this more Hebraic way, which I think gives one example of this broadening. And yeah, let me say something parenthetically here about language. And I appreciate that you started with language. Yeah, every time I say penal substitution, I feel a little bit nervous. So this is, a little bit of excursus, but potentially important for some listeners, either in your own conversations with others or what you're thinking about me right now. So when we published the book in 2000, if you'd have said, are you critical of penal substitution theory of atonement? I'd just say, yes, I am. There are people who affirm penal substitution who I tend to agree with. I mean, including, Scott McKnight, N.T. Wright, I mean, he does it. I mean, he's very, very critical of the same things I'm critical of, but he'll affirm, no, penal substitution is a biblical concept. Kevin Van Hooser, but all of them in their thinking I agree with. So I have gotten much more careful. Whenever I talk about penal substitution, I define it first. And so that's why, I started with that little story back when I was talking about my own experience. So when I'm saying penal substitution theory of atonement, I'm thinking of a theory of atonement that views the cross about appeasing God and that God needs to punish Jesus in our place in order to forgive. So, for instance, Kevin Van Hooser roots his thinking about penal substitution in Israel's covenant and that kind of legal understandings, and ends up being a very different story. So, okay, end of excursus. So now to justification. So through the lens of what I'm talking about, penal substitution and this Western legal understanding. So if you let's think about salvation, how the view of salvation differs. From this Western legal PSA view, justification is about me being shifted from one legal column to another. And it really has no implications for ongoing discipleship in my life, right? And again, I want to be very careful here. This is the way I thought about it. I became a Christian through it, and I was very active in discipleship. So I'm not saying that someone who thinks this doesn't believe in discipleship, doesn't do discipleship. But my point is, if you do evangelism in that way, and you explain justification that way, that explanation of the gospel does very little to put someone onto a path of discipleship in an ethics way. There's not a connection.
Sure.
Whereas if we go with the other, justification. So if you think of justification is restoration to covenant community. So Marcus Barth says you can't become a Christian alone. And what he means by that, he doesn't mean you got to go find somebody else, get two people and run together. But he means when you become a Christian, you're immediately brought into this community. And justification, it's about being rectified, made right. So if I'm telling the story in that way, then the person, as I'm telling it, this is what is happening. Yeah. As you are putting your faith in Jesus, you are being justified. It flows from that then we can talk about, and what are implications of that for your life, your commitment to others and what you receive to others. Okay, so that's on salvation.
Yeah.
Now think about church. So, and this is the way, I thought about church growing up, was if you go with the PSA way of thinking about it, church, I thought about it, this collection of individuals. You get more people into it, and you take this individual thing, and then you're in. But it's this collection of individual dots. We've been justified. But again, if we go this other way and think about through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, through being united with Jesus, you are brought into this covenant community. I mean, it's just a different picture of church right from the
Yeah.
beginning.
Yeah.
You're brought into this. And then God, the one is the image we started with of, this God that's kind of up there like, well, I'd like to forgive you, but the law says I can't. And so I'm going to punish. And at best, or it's this, God that wants to punish. In contrast, the other is a God that is lovingly, through self-sacrifice, substitution, coming in incarnationally, working to make things right, to fix things and bring us into right relationship. This is a God that is with us and for us.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. That is such a helpful set of like images, salvation and church, and thinking about all of it in those places feels immediately so helpful. And like there's two words that come to my mind, which is interesting. It's like empowering, and there's a newer responsibility with that, because
Yes.
to be invited to participate in the people of God is like an invitation for us. And then if the cross is an ethic that Jesus lives that we're called into, that's a way of living, that you've just like connected those dots so helpfully to the atonement doesn't feel isolated from the life or ethics or way of the people of God. It's like at the very center of it. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's so helpful. Mark, I've got you for just a few more minutes based upon the time commitment that I gave you. And so I want to ask you the question we talked about at the very beginning of our time together, that you said was an essential. If people want to dive more into this conversation, because there's so much more that we could do, there's so many more things that we could understand and study, are there resources that you would recommend to listeners if they want to dive in deeper, things that you've written or places to go, or where would you direct us?
Okay, so yeah, let me say a word about the two books and then something else. So Joel and I wrote this book, Recovering the Scandal of the Cross, which I'll circle back to in a moment. But, it was out 2 or 3 years. It's being used in some seminary classrooms. It started conversation. It was very good. But I just had this moment of, kind of aha moment of realizing that's great. But as long as at youth group meetings, in Sunday school classes, in tracts, people are still telling these stories and images of penal satisfaction, then in the broad Christian world, the paradigm is not going to change. And so then I was like, we need, not just great in-depth biblical thinking about the atonement. We need new and different images. So that's where I decided I'm going to try to get some of this into circulation. And the book, The Proclaiming the Scandal of the Cross, is a collection. I think there's 21 different presentations in it. And they're all, real life, temporary, textual from different contexts, including, there's a couple junior high Sunday school classes, some sermons, stories, home. So there are people that are using alternative imagery to penal substitution. And the first chapter of that book has a little bit of summary of the previous book. So for many, I'd say, maybe that's the place to start, because it's stories, sermons, and you can borrow from them. But then if it raises questions, if you're like, well, but how about this or how about that? Recovering the Scandal is, so Joel writes the first 4 chapters, which are just in-depth biblical work on the atonement. And then I do a couple chapters on history of, what have different ways of talking about the cross and atonement through history. Those are 2 books that I've been involved in. But then on my website is profmarkbaker.com. There's a page called Atonement Resources. And let me, just mention like a couple things that are on there. So one is, I have a video from an online class I did on this Hebraic versus Western. So if piqued your interest, but you're like, well, how do you know that's what it is? Yeah, it's a half an hour lecture you can listen to, or there's an article that does the same thing there. So you can go there and get that. And then also there's some great images like in the spirit of proclaiming the scandal of the cross, including my co-author from Ministry in Honor, Shame Cultures. There's a 5-minute video he made. He was a missionary in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan. And and it's very, very well contextualized. It would be very foreign to any of us because it's their culture. But it would he tells the biblical narrative of salvation so well through in terms of honor and shame. And you'll listen to it and you see it lines up biblically, but it's just, it's a fully different story. And so there's
Interesting.
some other things like that. And then, yeah, some other articles I've written, some examples of, how it's been helpful in people's lives, so that I would point people to those 3 things.
That's great. I was on your site. I mean, I messaged you, but I was on your site, and you have there's like a lot of really good resources there. You wrote recently a couple blogs on it. You have that site with all of the resources listed along with those 2 books and the videos. So it's kind of a wealth of resources on your website. That would be a good place for someone to go just to begin this conversation and find access to lots of things. So that's great. Well, Dr. Baker, I'm so grateful for your time with us and taking space to answer these questions and to be with us and to do so much thoughtful writing on atonement and the cross, as well as church and scripture and so many other like really helpful resources. So grateful for your time with us. Thanks for taking the time.
You are welcome. Thanks for the great questions and, helping spread this conversation. As I said in the beginning, we can do better. We must do better. And as I would say, I start my Christology classes, I'd write up on the whiteboard at the beginning, it's about more Jesus, more cross. And yeah, back to what I was saying about that language, where we started about atonement is the big, and then penal substitution, or then atonement, and then substitutionary atonement, and then penal substitution. I think, unfortunately, many people are understandably upset with these images from penal substitution or atonement, but I think they often then sort of feel like they need to get rid of substitutionary atonement. And I say, no, it's not about getting rid of. Actually, when we step away from PSA, it's about enriching and getting much, much more. And so let us just do better and have more Jesus and more cross.
I love that. What a good prayer and hope for the end. Let us do better and have more Jesus and more cross. And I appreciate the way you help us do that. And hopefully this conversation with you can be that for so many others. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jonny.